Yeah, so my name's Steve Arman. I live in Cambridge and I run a podcast called the Trig Point Podcast, which is a bit of a spin off of my photography and filmmaking business. I'm a 23-year veteran of the British Army, and that's the Royal Anglian Regiment, so our county-based infantry regiment. And I left just shy of 2 years ago now. The podcast itself is designed to speak to people that have sort of really pushed themselves to limits, really, in combat, in the civilian sector, in extreme sports and things like that. So it's quite an interesting thing. Fairly new, but it seems to be taking off quite well. Yeah, so the podcast, I'm only 2 episodes in at the minute. I've got a few more edited, ready to be uploaded. But the guests I've had on, I started with a guy called Ian Robinson, MBE, and he's a guy that I served with in the army. And he went all the way through to become a major. And we were fueled to do that podcast by the loss of a friend, a guy called Sergeant Matt Slater, who took his own life back in May, I believe, of this year. And it really sort of blindsided us. And myself and Ian Robinson, or Robbo as we call him, we were in a position in the army where we carried a fair bit of weight. I was a regimental sergeant major for my battalion, which is like the senior soldier of an organisation of about 700, if you like. And Robbo did the same job some years ago during our sort of busiest and most hectic tours of Afghanistan. So we felt we had a bit of a gravitas, if you like, without sounding big-headed, where people would listen to what we had to say, and we just wanted to get the point across that there is help out there. We wanted to sort of fall back on our own experiences of being exposed to mental health and dealing with people that have had issues with it. And then my more recent episode was 2 of my soldiers that I fought alongside in 2007. They were both private soldiers when I was a sergeant, and they were light machine gunners, and that was quite good fun hearing it from their sort of perspective. And I wanted to get their take on the recent extraction from Afghanistan and what their views were on it. And I was really sort of humbled and surprised with their opinions. I don't think everybody is under the opinion of, it was a waste of time. And them guys certainly didn't think that either. So, yeah, so it's picking up speed, and I've got quite a few lined up for the future as well. It's just a podcast designed to try and help the veteran community, make them smile and just make them realise that other people are probably thinking the same thing as them, really. I don't think the signals are going to be overly different, and I would just like to say that when the British Army or Her Majesty's Forces, we make a bit of noise about mental health in the veteran fraternity. What the veterans don't want to do is become martyrs. We fully understand that what has gone on overseas, or it might not necessarily be anything that happened on an operational tour. It might be in their private life. Everybody's programmed the same, be it someone that works in the civilian sector or a soldier. If you go through the loss of a loved one, you deal with trauma in the family. It's all exactly the same to our eyes. I just think it's worth reminding people that over the last 20 years that the British Army, the British military, has been involved in what is arguably the most violent combat scene since our forebear regiments fought in World War II. And it was always there was a lot of it. We do a 6-month tour, we do a 7-month tour, and then we'd already be thinking on return from that tour about the next one that was going to come around in 18 months. There was just so much exposure to it. And I think with regards to signs, it's just sort of presence of the abnormal of your loved ones. If people are being particularly quiet, if they're carrying out things and doing things that are a little bit out of character, then all of these things might be indicators that they've got a little bit on their plate, and maybe they could be signposted to someone for a little bit of help and support. So again, it's just that presence of the abnormal when people are doing things that are just a little bit out of character. But I've heard instances, and I'm certainly no mental health expert, of for example, the guy that took his own life from my regiment back in May, there wasn't a great deal out of the ordinary. he just decided that was the day to do it. It was obviously something that he was dealing with behind closed doors and on his own terms. But so it's a very tricky question. Like you said, what is the answer? But I think if you know people and they're just doing things that are slightly out of kilter, then that's probably the first alarm that should be ringing in your head, I think. So the Armed Forces Covenant, to my mind, it's the relationship between members of Her Majesty's forces and the government and the civilian world in the UK. It's sort of it's recognition of how we support each other. So it's an understanding of how the armed forces and what we do for the local populace and the country. Be under no illusion that when people are sleeping in their beds at night, there are people as we speak in foreign lands, training, protecting us from these people, learning information about them. They are fighting against them, gathering information. Now, people won't really understand that because it's not all over the press, but there's certainly things like that going on. The Army, Her Majesty's forces are all over the globe at the minute doing this sort of stuff, and that's all branches as well. And at the same note, I think it's the Covenant the armed forces, the members of the Army and people like that understand what the government, what the country expects from them. It's almost like a gentleman's agreement, if you like, of understanding on both parties. And the Covenant also helps people when they leave the military. It's agreed that there's a certain amount of aftercare that's required for people. And this is the same with our blue light services and things like that as well. The Covenant sort of affects them. And it's just an understanding on both parts, really, about what's expected from each other, what we expect, how we expect to be treated while we're serving and when we leave, and what the country expects from us, really. Okay, so an initiative that I've seen recently, so let's just go back a little bit. So the stigma of mental health is, within the armed forces especially, it is shrinking massively. People do understand that these things are real, and there's no real bravado involved in it anymore. And I think the most important thing that an individual can do is admitting that he or she has an issue. And they can just admit that to themselves, and then they need to take the first step. Unless someone really sort of gets behind them and pushes them towards help, the key is for them to take the first step. And that's probably the hardest step from my experience of having spoken to people that have needed to do this. And there's plenty of ways and means that you can do that. You can go online, you can type in mental health, and it will signpost you to all of the organisations that are long established and very, very effective in providing help. And I'm talking about people like the Samaritans, the combat stress for the veteran side of life. The list is endless. There's also a couple of really good organisations in East Anglia. One in particular is one that's sort of growing arms and legs very quickly, and that's called Combat Coffee. It's a walk-in establishment. There's one in Ipswich, and there's also one in Bury St Edmunds, which is just opened. And if you Google Combat 2 Coffee, all the information that you need, and look on Facebook as well, will tell you exactly where these places are. But effectively what they are, they're coffee shops that are run by, for the most part, veterans. It just so happens that the Royal Anglian Regiment is fronting the people that run these establishments at the minute. And it's a place for like-minded people to go, not necessarily going there and immediately start sort of, swapping stories and unloading their issues. It's somewhere for you to go in a comfortable environment where you can have a brew, sit down with like-minded people. And if you feel that alone may help, but if you feel that isn't helping, then also it's got plenty of information in the establishments about where you can go to seek further professional help. A lot of people might find that just the act of going in and having a brew and meeting someone that is of a similar cut of a similar cloth might be the thing that sort of gives them the help that they need. If not, then there's certainly a lot more that these places can offer. So they're really worth a look at. Very informal. You don't have to book an appointment. It is literally a coffee shop that sells amazing sausage rolls and makes good brews, and it's just a good starter for 10.